Welcome to MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 570. This program is in loving memory of Miriam Bas Elio Altes Allah Hashalom and in merit of Baruch ben Yomen ben Menucha Lana Altes, Yud Kislev ben Leah Rachel and Rachel Bas Liba Farkash, dedicated by Pinchas Taders by Miriam and Sarah Bas Rachel Altes. So today was Yud Kislev, the Chag HaGeula, when we celebrate the Geula, the redemption of the Mitteler Rebbe from prison. So just like his father, the Alter Rebbe, years before, on Yud Tes Kislev was the Geula of the Mitteler Rebbe. And it follows yesterday, Shabbos. The Shabbos was Tes Kislev, which is the birthday, and the Yom Hilula Yortzeit of the Mitteler Rebbe. So it's a Mitteler Rebbe season, so to speak. But of course, it's the month of Kislev, so it's also Yud Tes Kislev coming up to Yud Tes Kislev. We know the Pisgum, the famous Pisgum, that Yud Kislev is like the birth of a chassid, and Yud Tes Kislev is like the bris, 8 days later. And therefore, it's a chassidish month in that sense. And all goes hand in hand with the end of the month, Chanukah. It's again a celebration of light, celebration of shemen oil, which is Pnimi Satera. So it's all connected, in addition to the other special days of this month, starting from Rosh Chodesh Kislev, when the Rebbe went home after finally came out of after the heart attack and the threat and the fear and the connection to that he had suffered then in Shmini Atzeres. And Yud Kislev as well, later this week, which is the Rebbe and the Rebbe's anniversary. So we'll talk about all of that. Plus, of course, this week's parsha is the parsha of Vayishlach. And as always, Chassidus Applied, applying it to our personal, psychological, and emotional lives. Korevei lecha dover meid, relevant to us. So with that, I think the best place to begin is the most timely, Yud Kislev itself. We're in Yud Kislev, so let's talk about Yud Kislev. What do we learn from this day? So in general, every geula, like the Gemara says, even a geula pratis, even an individual redemption or salvation a person goes through, has in it a taste of the big geula, meaning the freedom that we will ultimately experience with the geula mitzvah v'ashlema. Began with geulas Mitzrayim. So all the geulas are on the name of geulas Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim comes from the word constraints, limitations, everything that limits us, we are freed from. So Geula is more than just a physical getting out of prison. It's a getting out of the psychological prison, emotional prison, anything that traps us. And when it's the Geula of a Rebbe, Yud Kislev, obviously then it's a Geula Klolis, because the Rebbe is a Nossi B'Yisrael. So his Geula is, in the words of the Frierdiker Rebbe about Yud Beis Tam, is Loi Oisi Belvad Gol HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was not me, privately or personally, that God redeemed, but it was a redemption for all the Yidden. And the same thing with the Mitteler Rebbe. So the first thing we learn from it is that no matter what challenges we have, and we all have our challenges, we all have our personal or microcosmic difficulties, we can call it Golos. So we learn that there's always hope, that we have B'tochen in Hashem, trust in God, and you forge ahead and commit to the right things, there will be breakthroughs. Now, obviously, we have to talk about more specifically connected to Yud Kislev, and we'll get to that. But that's the first very basic lesson. In the month of Kislev in general, I mentioned Chanukah. That's what Chanukah was. On one hand, Timu Kol HaShmonim Shebehechel, they desecrated the temple, the Greek-Syrians, and including all the oil, the pure olive oil in the Beis Hamikdash, but then they found one flask of oil, and it was enough to burn for 1 day, for 8 days. So that means there's always a spark that's alive. That's a critical thing to keep in mind no matter what challenges we face. Every one of us has, as we all know personally, Yod Nafshi, everyone knows within their own soul the different challenges. So that's the first thing we learn from Yud Kislev. More specifically, what is unique about Yud Kislev? So it's the Geula of the Mitteler Rebbe. The Mitteler Rebbe as I said, is the second Chabad. The Rebbe came as a son of Maamar Mokim, the Bechor, the oldest son of the Alter Rebbe. So as soon as you hear about the Yud Kislev, you think about Yud Tes Kislev. So a person asks, what distinguishes this liberation from Yud Tes Kislev? So let us discuss a bit the distinction between these different geulas. So overall, both the Alter Rebbe and the Mitteler Rebbe were informed upon by their enemies. And again, essentially, it was a challenge to the spreading of Torah and Chassidus. The Alter Rebbe in his time, and then the Mitteler Rebbe. It does say in Beis Rebbe and other places that in the Yud Tes Kislev, the challenge was the spreading of Chassidus, the Kitrig, so-called, the opposition. And the Mitteler Rebbe was in opposition to the idea of a Rebbe and a Chassid. But it's all connected, because the Rebbe and Chassid is also connected, obviously, to Chassidus. So has that distinct element. The Rebbe explains in a number of sikhs when he talks about Yud Kislev and Yud Tes Kislev, he says that the fact that there could have been a geula, another arrest and a geula by the Mitteler Rebbe means that something was not finished. So, because once the Alter Rebbe was vindicated, especially in heaven, so what do we? Why is there a challenge again? Remember, these are all oppositions not that begin on earth; they begin in heaven. As some type of question mark whether they're doing the right thing. So you have to say it was about the unique way that the Mitteler Rebbe spread Chassidus. And that is, as is known, that the Alter Rebbe was chochmah and the Mitteler Rebbe binah. As we see it very, very visibly, looking at the Maamorim of the Alter Rebbe and Mitteler Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, what he spoke about in brief, in a concentrated spark of an akud of chochmah, became expansive. And literally you can see, one page of the Alter Rebbe could be 5 pages or more by the Mitteler Rebbe. So the Cheves Hanor, the expansive river of the Mitteler Rebbe, is what binah does to chochmah. It takes an akuda, a point, and it develops it. And you see that very clearly in all the Maamorim. So in a sense, and now that the Mitteler Rebbe is arrested, you have to say that it was like a challenge in the expansion of Chassidus, not just, it's not a just, but the first challenge was on the chochmah of Chassidus. Now it's a challenge on the binah of Chassidus. And that too was vindicated and ultimately affirmed with the geula of the Mitteler Rebbe. What it means to us personally is that in the context of what I spoke about earlier, about the fact that all of us have our challenges, so you can have challenge and you can be freed from it. But the question is whether new challenges that come your way, that sometimes were not addressed in the first bounce, so to speak, will they also be overcome? So the fact is, the Mitteler Rebbe affirms that it's not just a one-time thing. But more importantly, in the context of our discussion here, the Mitteler Rebbe was taking the Mayanesecha, which is usually chochmah, and really beginning to spread it. He was publishing Chassidus in a very grand scale, publishing Sfarim, right at the outset from when he began his leadership. And that was a question. Should it go to that extent? And of course the answer was yes. So today, when we look at back then, we have now an open channel, the permission from heaven itself to reach everywhere in the most expansive possible way. Sometimes you could say, you know what, you have permission to reveal something, but in a limited way. Here there's no limits at all. So in a way you can say that the Rebbe in our generation, 7th generation, really opening up the floodgates of printing all of Chassidus and many languages and spreading it wherever possible is a breakthrough that the Mitteler Rebbe contributed to, or perhaps more than that, through his geula. In effect, basically, as Chassidus was developing, we had stages, and all these stages have become clearly affirmed in heaven and below, that we will be successful. And it's all leading, obviously, to transform the world to a world where the world will be filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea, the ultimate binah, the ultimate cheves hanor, that the waters cover the sea, in the fullest expansive fashion. That's both in quantity and in quality. So that's a general way of understanding. Do we know why this day is not celebrated with the same level of festivities as the 19th of Kislev? So generally speaking, the Frierdiker Rebbe was asked this question once, and his response was that it was celebrated. That his grandfather, Reb Marash, Yud Kislev, was always made a big farbrengen. So basically he negated the concept that it wasn't celebrated quite the same way. Some say that because Yud Kislev, the Geula, right, followed right after the Istalkus of the next year, Tes Kislev was the Istalkus, the passing of the Mitteler Rebbe. So that first year, they were all under the influence. It was the next day, celebrating the first anniversary of the Geula, or the second, depending what year it happened. But let's assume, according to most opinions, it was the year before. So by the time the first anniversary came, it was a day after the Istalkus. So some say that's why it wasn't done with a full fanfare, simply because they were literally sitting shiva for the Mitteler Rebbe. But that does not mean there was anything, God forbid, weaker in the very celebration. It was just not pronounced. But the following years, the Frierdiker Rebbe says clearly, it was beferish celebrated in a very expansive way, and he describes it with many stories of what happened at these farbrengens. There's the Reb Marash. The Reb Marash, of course, was a grandson of the Mitteler Rebbe. And of course, in all generations after that, we continue that tradition. Okay. The next question, which we just answered, was, what are some of the differences between the arrest and liberation of the Alter Rebbe and the Mitteler Rebbe, and how do these differences manifest in expressions of chochmah and binah? So I explained the chochmah and binah part. The differences, there are obviously technical differences. The Mitteler Rebbe's imprisonment was not as harsh. They allowed Chassidim to come. A doctor had said that it's important for the health of the Mitteler Rebbe to say Chassidus. So they allowed 50 Chassidim to come once or twice a week. So it was generally not as harsh, and there was also a deep respect for the Mitteler Rebbe. Alter Rebbe there was also respect, but not quite the same way. But that's more on a technical level. On a deeper level, as I said, these are two different times and two different situations. And what's relevant to us is primarily the way Chassidus is being spread. So both the chochmah and binah have now experienced geula, basically. Okay. Another question. Can you summarize the Maamar Padah B'sholom Nafshi delivered by the Rebbe on the 10th of Kislev, Tovshin Chav Beis? So Shabbos Parsha Vayetze that year was Yud Kislev. And interesting, it was the only time the Rebbe said three Maamorim. Three Maamorim. One was Padah B'sholom, one was Ata Echad, and the third was it also Padah B'sholom? I'm not sure. I have to look it up. The three Maamorim. And Padah B'sholom was actually Mugeh, I believe. So I'll give a summary. It's worthy, since it's fitting, rather, being that today is Yud Kislev. Okay, so briefly, the famous statement, famous way Chassidus explains Padah B'sholom Nafshi, also by the Alter Rebbe. That's the pasuk he said in Tehillim when they came to free him, the pasuk that corresponded to the third day of the week, Tuesday. And the same thing with the Geula of the Mitteler Rebbe. He was also saying Padah B'sholom Nafshi, which fitting, it's literally the meaning of Geula. Padah B'sholom Nafshi, my nefesh, my spirit is redeemed, B'sholom, in peace. So the Di Chassidus and the Rebbe would emphasize almost every year when he said the Maamar Padah B'sholom Nafshi, why does it say B'sholom? It means there's a way of a padiyah that comes through Melchomah. You could also be redeemed in a battle, through a battle. So in that Maamar, Tovshin Chav Beis, he actually talks about three ways how we redeem ourselves from the battles of our lives. We talked before about the Golos, each of us has our challenges. But the ultimate battle, the internal battle, is the battle, as he explains in Tanya, between the divine soul and the animal soul. It's a battle. In chapter 9 in Tanya, in a very explicit way, the Alter Rebbe gives the example of two kings, two empires at war, and actually spells out, I believe it's 9 steps even, of how you conquer, how you win a battle. You can win a battle, but it's not really transforming yet the entire city that you fought over. Ir Ktana Ze Aguf. So in this Maamar, he talks about 3 levels of how to fight a battle. The battle with the animal soul. One is B'derech Mulchama. But derech milchama means you roll up your sleeves, so to speak, and you must mislabish, you manifest yourself in levushe hamizbarer to deal with the animal soul close up in a way that you are affected by it, with the goal of sublimating and ultimately conquering the nefesh habamis. So the positive side of that is that you're directly engaging with the animal soul. On the other hand, because you're engaging close up is a battle. And battles have consequences. Battles have casualties. Comes the second level, the menucha, not with a battle. By intensifying and strengthening the divine soul, the more you strengthen it so it's light dispels darkness. And there you don't have to have a battle. It's just the intensity of the divine, of our preoccupation with divine matters, that itself overwhelms the animal soul. What's the problem with that? With there, you don't have necessarily a full transformation. You could affect it, but a full transformation comes step 3. And that's where you megal yechida shebenefesh. When a person's etzem, the very core of their soul, is expressed, then that is the power to transform. Not just the power of light dispelling darkness, or the power of the light or the nefesh elikis fighting with the darkness. But here you have the power to transform. Because what you're doing is you're accessing a place that is just the Chatchila Rebbe, so to speak. Goes far beyond light and dark. And when a person is there, there's no room even for any negative. And even in step 2, even though it's not through a war, but still there's 2 forces, dark and light, and through a lot of light, you'll dispel darkness. The Rebbe elaborates there about how a neshama connects to Yechida Shebenefesh. That's the 3rd level. So that's a lesson in life. We see this all the time, each of us, when we're facing challenges, we're encountering difficulties. There's times you have to fight and battle, close up. There are times, and that's engaging. There are times you can do it by adding a lot more light. There are times you reach such a deep level of totally, you completely, in a way, like a metamorphosis into a whole different state where you're accessing a level that's completely beyond it all. And that's what gives you the power to overcome, and more than that, transform the animal soul. His hapche. Okay. Since we're about Yud Kislev, there's another question about a Maamar, so I want to ask this question. What was the name of the Mitteler Rebbe's Maamar discussing the reason for the decree of the Cantonists? And what lessons can we learn from it that we can apply to other tragedies and evil decrees against us? Hoyele, we should never have any decrees. But it is a Maamar that called Lahavan Inyan Lekichas Anshe Chayil. Mitteler Rebbe said a Maamar to understand the idea of drafting Anshe Chayil, soldiers. And the Cantonists was one of the situations where the Russian government was drafting Jewish children at an early age for 30 years, for who knows how many years. It was a real gzeda. It changed people's lives. Children that wouldn't come back for many years. And many of them, in a way, was lost to us. A lot of stories about the Cantonists. And the Mitteler Rebbe addressed it as one of the decrees of Gzedus of Golus, but ultimately the topic of Birer HaNetzutzes, that throughout the years of history, we have, of course, the 288 general sparks that have been scattered all over the world. Every time we do a mitzvah, we do a Birer, we are redeeming, again, Padah, hopefully B'sholom Nafshi, we're redeeming a spark. When all these sparks are redeemed, it's called the end of Birer HaNetzutzes. He explains in Tanya and in Torah Vayeshev that these sparks, of course, break down into many details. So everything we do in this world, wherever we travel, the work we do, our families, the food we eat, is all about elevating sparks. And then there are situations, gzeiros, that are more harsher, where the sparks have really fallen to very dark places. And that's when you have these harsh decrees, like the drafting of these Yidden into the army, where they're really, it's ultimately its purpose is to redeem sparks, but it's very complicated because it's difficult. They're put through tremendous nisyonos and challenges, and the Mitteler Rebbe talks about those challenges, and talks about Golus in general and what we have to do, and realize that even then, is as difficult as it may be, those are some of the deepest and greatest sparks of all, are the ones that go full so and end up in such dark places. So the lesson is basically, and the Rebbe emphasizes it time and again, no matter what comes our way, there's always a divine purpose in it. And there's always sparks. And the darker the situation, the deeper are the sparks. That's why in Ikvus of the Mashiach in our later generations, we have many challenges. So on one hand, things are easier for the Jewish people, but some challenges are harder. Challenges of prosperity. Evdim be'eretz asher, as the Rebbe explains. We get lost in prosperity. We get lost when it's Eretz Mitzrayim, the Golus of Mitzrayim, which is poverty, affliction, oppression, is nedochim. We get pushed aside, downtrodden. But Evdim, we get lost in the comforts because we become apathetic. And that that does a lot of damage within internally. So the Golus in some ways is deeper then, and that's when the sparks are the hardest to redeem. When a person is not in good shape, but they're suffering, at least they're aware that there's a problem. But when you're comfortable and you feel everything is good. So this is all part of the lessons we learn from it. The Rebbe speaks about it as well. The Rebbe said a Maamar, also in the early Chavs, Tovshin Chav Gimel, I believe, on the Maamar of the Mitteler Rebbe. Today the Maamarim are printed. Mitteler Rebbe's Maamar is printed in the Confrontations of the Mitteler Rebbe, where he talks about this topic. Okay, when I was a bocher, the Maamar we had it in Kupir. Kupir means it's typed, it wasn't published formally, but we had it, today we have it published with all the footnotes and so on. Okay. So let's talk about Yud Kislev now. From Yud Kislev, Yud Kislev is the anniversary in tiferes Peites. The Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were married in the city of Warsaw. We're coming to soon be the 100th anniversary in 3 years. Now we're Pevov. We're in the year Pevov. We're in Tavshin Pevov. Tavshin Peites will be the 100th. So we're 97th anniversary of the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. So what does this day mean to us? So the Rebbe himself said at his 25th anniversary, which was in Tavshin Yud Daled. Yud Daled was 14 plus the 25th anniversary from tiferes Peites. So the Rebbe had a Fabrengen then. And he said, today is the day, heint is der Tag, was zusammengebunden mir mit euch und euch mit mir. It's the day that bound us together. So someone asked, why was this the day that connected the Rebbe to us? Well, someone spelled it out more in detail. What I don't understand is before the Rebbe married the Rebbetzin, he was already a Schneerson and a direct great-grandchild of the Tzemach Tzedek. So why? She was already part of the royal family of Chabad leaders that spread Chassidus. Would it have made more sense to say Yud Aleph Nisan was the day that connected the Rebbe to the Chassidim? So the answer is quite obvious, actually, if you think about it. Yes, the Rebbe was definitely from the Tzemach Tzedek, but direct lineage as a Mamala Mokum of the Frierdiker Rebbe comes through the Rebbetzin. Had the Rebbe hypothetically not married the Rebbetzin, we don't know where it would have been, B'derech HaTeva. Hashem's plans, Hashem always decides, at the end of the day, God's the final decider. But B'derech HaTeva, it was the marriage to the Rebbetzin, which in turn made the Rebbe, that's why the Rebbe would refer to Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe de Shver, my father-in-law. So yes, he had the Rebbe's father also had a lineage straight to the Tzemach Tzedek. But as a Rebbe, especially the Deir Ashvi, the Nosei Ashvi, comes directly from the Nosei Ashishi, from the Frierdiker Rebbe. That's the so-called practical explanation. But obviously, it only helps that the Rebbe also has zichus from this father's side, meaning from his own as being the son of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, who was in turn a son and all the way a grandson of Tzemach Tzedek. Okay, so that is that. But what does it really mean personally? That's the day that connected us. What does it mean, a connection? So connection, obviously, is, as we know, is Kashrus to Rebbe, is a fundamental idea in Chassidus in general, The Iskashus to Rebbe is a shliach of Hashem, sent to this world to fulfill the very purpose of this generation, as the Rebbe says, the Der Ashvi, to bring the Geula. We are shluchim of the Rebbe, and students of the Rebbe, as we're connected to the Rebbe, gives us the power and the schus and the merit to achieve that goal. So a day like Yud Kislev is like a day where we renew our contract with that connection. So the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin are dugma for Zoh and Malchus, a dugma for Malka Matrenisa, like the Chassidus explains, Kutshabricha and Knesset Yisroel, is what it's in the Stalsher from, when he took Yem Chasanos, Zem Matan Teda, but on a earthly level, it means a day when they come together, that creates a connection that gives us kayach. The Rebbe Sichas, where he talks at length about the yichud of Yitzchok and Rivka, Ma'oban, Sicha connected to Kinus Ashluchim. So all that can be applied, and we have the Maimorim, of course, of the Rabbeim, the famous Samach to Samach that the Tiferes Nun Zayin, that the Rebbe Rashab said at the Frierdiker Rebbe's wedding. Another Maimorim, L'chodedi, that we learn at the Cantonists, Maimon that the Frierdiker Rebbe said at the Rebbe's wedding. So all that teaches us that this union of Rebbe and Rebbetzin gives us the kayach to create the unions that we create in our own lives, begashmis and beruchnis. And the Rebbe concluded and he said, "Zusammen wird man eis matter in dem Golas." After he said, "This is the day that connects us. Today we will wear down the Golas," talking about Golas. And Mezolzem Peiris, the Rebbe said, we should see fruit from our labor. In my book, Torah Meaning for Life, at the time I realized a story that I had heard, and I connected it to those words of the Rebbe, the fruit that was a year, the anniversary of the Yud Rebbe and the Rebbe's Yud Kislev. So there was a Rebbetzin Cohen who knew the Rebbetzin well, and she came to visit the Rebbetzin, I guess to wish her Mazel Tov, or wish her good greetings on the anniversary. The Rebbetzin was showing her around in the house on President Street, different flowers people had sent. But Mrs. Cohen, Rebbetzin Cohen, saw from a distance, she looked into the kitchen, she saw there a beautiful bouquet. But the Rebbetzin didn't take her there, but because she looked. So the Rebbetzin realized she's curious. So they walked there to the kitchen, and she asked the Rebbetzin, "And who sent these flowers?" She says, "This came from my husband." They got closer, she realized they weren't flowers. They were actually flowers, but shaped from dry fruit in the shape of flowers. Fruit. So when I heard the story, I decided to include it. It's the Yud Kislev story, and the Rebbe said, "Mezolzem Peiris," which is see fruit from our efforts. So though flowers are beautiful, but in a way flowers wither. Fruit always lasts. Dry fruit, you can eat it, but most importantly, fruit represents Peiris. My Peir mitzvahs. Peir is connected to fruit, is connected to mitzvahs. Till the saying shel tzadikim is the maisim tevim, their good deeds are fruits. So Yud Kislev is meant to produce fruit, and we are those fruit. We are the Rebbe's children. Shenantam levanecha ela talmidim. The students are the children, and the children carry on are the fruit of the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. So Yud Kislev is a day for us to reconnect, and most importantly, translate it into action. Are we making the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin proud? Are we living up to their legacy? Are we fulfilling the mandate that they gave us, the Mesiras Nefesh, of all the years that the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin together gave us in fulfilling what we need to fulfill? And being that it comes in the month of Kislev, and following Yud Kislev, and before that Tes Kislev, leading to Yud Tes Kislev, coming from Rosh Chodesh Kislev, so we have tremendous amount of strengths in this month of Kislev, which is called Chodesh HaGeula in a way, because the Geula of Chanukah, the Geula of Yud Tes Kislev, all the other Geulas, that to help us to free ourselves from the trappings of our animal soul in a way of Padah B'sholom Nafshi. Okay. In a peaceful way. So how do we practically apply the Rebbe and the Rebbe's anniversary to our personal lives? So I just stated that by acting like the true fruits that we should be, fruits that are similar to with the tree which bore those fruit, and that's the key thing to our introspection that we need to have. In addition, the very fact that was a chasen is a yichud, is a union, So we too should be looking at our lives, our personal lives, our family lives, our marital lives, and also the lives of our communities, to see everything we can do to bring unity, to bring more love, to bring more connection, to bring more fusion of the two, of Mashpia Makabel, of Zoh and Malchus, which is embodied in every chassid and kala. Okay. Let us now move to the parsha. Let's talk about the parsha. As always, the parsha is connected to the events that happened in this parsha, that happened during the events that happened throughout history during this parsha. So you can make a connection between Vayishlach and Yud Kislev and Yud Tes Kislev, which we'll attempt to do. Here's a good opportunity to refer you to ChassidusApplied.com is the website where all previous programs are archived that you can access, as well as the place where there's a forum where you can submit any question. Nothing is off limits, nothing is taboo, and please take advantage of this. Today we also are using AI tools, so we have now WhatsApp AI, which you can access easily. You can either do it through my name, simonjacobson.ai, or go to meaningfullife.com and just type in any question, and you'll find the answers that were given in previous years at MyLife or other programs and writings that we've done. So it's another great tool of Yefutzu Meinesecha Chutza. So we've discussed, of course, Vayishlach many times during these years, but we'll talk about a few more questions that came in, and hopefully try to do justice to this Chassidus Applied program. Okay. What lessons do we learn from living with the times with this week's Torah portion? So first, let's go over what is the theme of the Torah portion. So Vayishlach Yaakov Melachim, Yaakov sent messengers, either actual angels or messengers, like Rashi says, to go see where is Esau holding. Now keep in mind, this is after Parsha Vayetze, Yaakov hol Chadarke, after 20 years under the difficult Lavan. Yaakov had built his family. He had his Geula from Lavan. He built his family, except Binyamin, all the Shvatim and Dinah were born in Haran. So in the darkest of places, the wrath of God, Haran Afshal Mokim, that's where Yaakov built a family. So now he's coming back. He's coming back to Eretz Yisrael. 20 years. And what's the story with Esau? Remember, last time we know about Esau was angry, furious, wanted to kill him after he felt that he had stolen his blessings. So he sends Malachim to see. Chassidus immediately says, and we'll talk about this now more at length, now why did he send Malachim? He wanted to see. He thought maybe Yaakov thought that maybe Esau was ready, kvar nizbarer. Maybe Esau was refined. In other words, Yaakov understood that his battles with Esau were not just a private battle. They began in the mother's womb, L'umalum Yemots, 2 nations, 2 empires, 2 archetypes. And he wanted to, maybe it's finished. Maybe Esau has finally gone through what he had to go through. But he discovers, no, he's going with Arba Me'asish, he's going with 400 people ready for war. So he realized, sadly, that Esau was not yet in his batters. And then the story continues, the details of how he prepares. First he davens to Hashem, then he prepares his family. He prepares a bribe to appease Esau. And he prepares for war as well. Then it says that after crossing the river Yavak, the river, with his family, he goes back because he had forgotten pachim ktanim, small containers that were left behind. He goes back, and that's where Vayavik Imei, he meets this strange character. We find out is the angel of Esau, who wrestles with Yaakov all night, but he cannot prevail over him. As the dawn breaks, the angel of Esau displaces Yaakov's hip. And that's why we don't need the Gid Anosha, as the pasuk says. But Yaakov won't let him go until he blesses him, changes his name from Yaakov to Yisroel. Because you have fought with the Elikim and Anoshim, messengers of God, and you have prevailed. And then finally, Esau and Yaakov meet. And this very dramatic moment, they reconcile. The question is, whether it's with complete heart or not complete heart, but there's no war. He accepts the bribes, if you wish. He accepts the gifts, let's call them. And then Esau says to Yaakov, now that we've reconciled, why don't we come live near me? Ove aldeni se'era. He's inviting him to where Esau. Yaakov recognizes that he's not yet ready. Saying Rakes, the sheep are tender, the children are young. You go ahead, Visnaloliti, I'll come slowly. Rashi reiterates, says, what do you mean? He knows he's not coming. No, he will come when Mashiach comes. V'yisel Hashem Amlucha. Yaakov and Esau will finally make full peace. Meanwhile, it's a partial peace. And then the story continues with other parts of the parsha that talk about the story of Shechem. We'll see whether we have time to cover what we have to cover. The end of the parsha, interestingly, is all about the progeny of Esau. That's the end of Vayishlach. The children and grandchildren where Esau lived and who were his descendants and so on. So when we look at the story, the question, of course, is what's really going on? What is the deeper meaning of the story of Jacob and Esau, their battle and reconciliation? And from there, we'll be able to come and learn lessons living with the times in this week's Torah portion. And once you understand the general picture, you can also understand the details. So I'll address the details. A lot of questions came in on this. But let's first talk about the overall story. As I mentioned, these are two archetypes. This is not even, you don't even need any pshat, any derush, remes, sod. It's the Psasik says, L'um melum yemot. Yaakov and Esau are two nations. K'shazeh comes and Nephil. They're antithetical to each other. Alter egos. Diametric opposites. This one is Ish Melchama Yedid Tzayid. Esau is a warrior, a hunter. Yaakov is Ish Tom Yeshiv Ahalim. He's a pure, innocent, wholesome individual. Dwells in the tents, is learning Torah. So each of us has a Yaakov and Esau within us. And in history, Yaakov and Esau represent two archetypes, two empires. Yaakov would be the ancestor of all the Jewish people through the Shvatim, the tribes. Esau would be the ancestor of many nations of the world. As it says at the end of Parsha Vayishlach, Magdiel is one of his grandchildren. Zuremi, Rashi says that's Rome. Rome is what? Is basically Malchus Edom, this final Golis, the Roman, Western, Christian civilization, which essentially is Europe or Russia. Today there's Sanchedav was Mavalbal things, but overall that's the world. And we talk about Malchus Edom, the final Malchus, after Golos Mitzrayim, Golos Bovel, Parasamodai, Yavan. Some also include under the Shmuelites, comes finally the Golos of Edom, the long Golos that we're in right now. So the story of Yaakov and Esau is not just an individual story that happened back there. It's two nations, two archetypes. Tzemach Tzedek, in explaining Tanya, he brings Yaakov and Esau as the example of the Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, Nefesh Elikis, Nefesh Abamis, a microcosm. A macrocosm, two. But Esau doesn't go away. By Matan Torah, the Eibishter offers Esau Torah. Later, the Bnei Esau, Roimi, will give birth to Christianity, and the Rambam says that's the Yasher Saderach that helps pave the way to Mashiach, with all its flaws. And the end of the story, like Rashi says, will be V'hisla Hashem Amlucha. So Yaakov sending malachim to see, sending messengers to see if Esau is ready, where he thinks he may be, is part of a larger story. It's not just a personal one. It's personal, but also a broader story. That the ultimate goal is there should be shalom, Padah B'sholom Nafshi, between the two. And that's the connection to Yud Tes Kislev and Yud Kislev as well. One of the sikhs, I think in Tovshin Dala, the Mitteler Rebbe says, a parsha Vayishlach Retzach v'Shviras HaKelim, because the end of the parsha is about Esau, Vayimlach Vayomos, that refers to the Shviras HaKelim. The shattering of the containers in Toyu, which comes, that's connected to Esau, was rooted in Toyu. Yaakov is rooted in Tikkun. And he says, and that's what Yud Tes Kislev is, a Tikkun of Shviras HaKel. In the Sikha, I believe in Tov Shemem Zayin, on this parsha, Vayishlach, the Rebbe speaks about it, explains it. Because the whole of history is the birur of Esau. Esau represents the Nefesh HaBamis, Esau represents Umas Ha'elam, the nations of the world. Yaakov represents the Yidden, who are coming to refine that part of the world. We all know that the Alter Rebbe initially opposed, not only initially, in his time he opposed Napoleon winning the war against Alexander. These are all battles of Esau. But Napoleon represented godlessness. So even though Begashmis it would have been easier for the Yidden, but Baruchnis it would be worse. The Rebbe says, what in Vayeshev Tov Shenun Beis? 7 generations later, now we have the power to be Mavared Esau. So just like Yaakov first thought maybe he's already refined, and he discovers he's not, but now we have that power. Now we've gone through all this Aveda, through all the years, and now these last 7 generations. So the Rebbe says that now we can be Mavared Esau. And how do you do that? Through learning Torah, through Kima Mitzvahs, and through Primis HaTorah, Chassidus. That explains also why the Alter Rebbe got involved in this, besides being a leader, because it's all part of the plan. How do we refine Esau? At that point, the Alter Rebbe said, it's not through Napoleon. It's too difficult, too materialistic, in a way like what Yaakov said. We're not ready yet. Isnalo leiti. We go slowly. 7 generations later says, now we can. And the Rebbe explains in that Sikha Vayeshev Tov Shenun Beis why he transformed the nigun of the French anthem to V'haderes Amun El Chai Elomim. That's the transformation of Esau. There you see the connection, my friends. Number 1, to Yud Tes Kislev, to Yud Kislev. All these battles, the arrest of the Alter Rebbe, the arrest of the Mitteler Rebbe. This is Esau basically challenging Yaakov. This is the wrestling of the Malach of Esau with Yaakov. But Kisaris Elikim Ba'anoshim Batuchal, we're Yisroel. We have the power to prevail. But Yaakov was not left uninjured. He displaced his hip. Says the Ramban that the displacement of the hip of Yaakov represents the displacement, the pain and suffering that every tzaddik in all the generations, that Yidden would suffer. Obviously, it doesn't mean that he doesn't describe the Holocaust yet. The Rambam was before that, but it means the Holocaust and the Inquisitions and the pogroms. Every suffering, all from that fateful night that the Zohar actually says was Yom Kippur night, interestingly, that fateful wrestling. But obviously there'll be the tikkun of Yerech Yaakov. Interesting, in the Pardes of the Ramak, he has a shar called Shar Yerech Yaakov, the hip of Yaakov. Because it's a big part of the birur, of the refinement, of transforming the world. So Yaakov prevailed. Yisroel, Kisarisim Elikim V'anoshim Batuchal. He prevailed. But the work still has to be done. And the Rebbe says now we are ready. When he said that Vedas HaBerurim are finished, means all these years of work, especially the last 7 generations. Deir Ashvi, this is the generation that will finish the job. So you see how this parsha is such a central chapter in the whole history and also in our personal lives, in our own battles between the Yaakov and Esau within us. Yaakov and Esau are Amurim B'Parsha. Remember, both of them are Amurim B'Parsha, and their root, they come from the Parsha, it's Torah. So with that, let's go now to some specific questions once we have established this general principle. Why were the small vessels so important that Jacob put himself at risk by returning to retrieve them? In the parsha, it tells the story that when Yaakov and his family were about to have a confrontation with Esau and his 400 mercenaries, Yaakov forgot a few vessels on the other side of the river, and he went back alone to retrieve them. On the surface, this doesn't seem like the smartest action because protecting lives is more important than mitzvahs. Hence, we are allowed to violate Shabbos to rescue someone in danger. How much more so when it's not clear that these vessels were for any particular mitzvah, They may have just been cooking or storage vessels. It would have made more sense for Yaakov to stay with his family to protect them in case Esau tried to launch a sneak attack. Can Rabbi Jacobson please discuss what Yaakov was thinking and what was the importance of these vessels? If the Torah is telling this story, it's only because it's to teach us a valuable lesson. What is the lesson here for us to learn from this story? Thank you. So I think, well, let's spell it out, but I think it's pretty obvious. Pachim ktanim. So pachim ktanim means small containers. Pach can also be it can also be referred to, it says in Mefarshim, to the pach, to the flask of oil that remained pure. The story of Chanukah. Pachim ktanim is referring to this final last sparks. It says in the Gemara that a Talmid Chacham is makpid, even on a shava pruta, even on pachim ktanim, even on the smallest things, because everything has a divine spark in it, and there's no such thing as too small. Yaakov was going back because that was the whole purpose of the journey, was to refine the world, and he realized there's pachim ktanim still remaining. There's explanation in Torah why it remained on this side of the river. What's the meaning of the river? Yavak, Avak. The Alter Rebbe has a whole explanation on that. I wrote about it a number of times on meaningfullife.com. So it's a whole story. It's a story of Birurim. He's going back for the Birurim. And when he does, it's not so easy. You can't get the last spark so easily. You have an angel to deal with, the angel of Esau. And it starts the wrestling. Because the Aveda is not over. Yaakov knew all of this, consciously, superconsciously, but he knew. What does that mean in our lives? When the Rebbe sends shluchim to every corner of the world to find pachim ktanim, you could say, concentrate where most of the Jews are. We're sending someone in Vietnam, in Bangkok, in somewhere in Asia, in Siberia, South America, wherever. Pachim ktanim. We need atem tluktu le'echad echad. It says Mashiach will come. We will gather everyone by their hand. There's nothing too small. Every individual matters. Every spark has to be refined. But in going to these places, yes, there were those challenges. Material challenges, spiritual challenges. But look at the shluchim. Look what they've accomplished. Echad mehem gola lebarbaria. Echad lesarmatia. In one of the Rebbe Rashab Sichos in Teira Shalom, he says, Mechalshem b'Mashiach, aber hat zu tun mit Emetzen in Barbaria. We have to save someone in Barbaria. Pachim ktanim. So the Yaakov knew what his role was. And then he deals with the angel, which leads us to the next question. Why did Esau's angel wrestle with Jacob and displace his hip? What was going on during the story of Yaakov wrestling with Esau's angel? How can angels attack people if angels are spiritual energies and don't even reside in the same dimension with physical humans? Was this story just a metaphor for some internal struggles that Yaakov was facing and needed to overcome? The answer is the angel of Esau represents the ruchnius of Esau. Sar shel Esau. Like every nation in the world has a Sar, has an ambassador, a divine ambassador. So Yaakov wrestling with him was wrestling with Esau himself in a sense. Again, the battle between the two archetypes, Lumalum Yemotz. Yaakov prevails, but he displaces his hip, as we discussed. In Zohar, it says actually the hip represents the Tamchin Daraisa. He knew he could not attack Yaakov, the Torah of Yaakov. Yaakov represents Torah. And the three pillars. Avram is Chesed, Gemilas Chasodim. Yitzchak is Gvura, Tefillah, Aveda, Torah, Aveda, Gemilas Chasodim, Aveda, and Yaakov is tiferes, Torah, Aveda, Gemilas Chasodim. So he knew he could not attack the Torah, but Tamchin, the hip, the supporters of Torah. That's what the Zohar says, that he attacks the supporters of Torah, the donors, the philanthropists. He looks for the extremities, somewhere that he could displace. So it's all part of this bigger battle. Continuing on, can we contrast that with Jacob protecting his head with stones earlier? In Parsha Vayetze. If Yaakov protected himself by putting stones around his head, is that why the angel was able to attack and injure his hip, because it was not protected and defended? Would it have been better if Yaakov surrounded his entire body with stones? So there's actually a whole sikha from the Rebbe on this as well, in Tafshin Nun Beis, I believe, as well, where he talks about this, whether the stones covered his entire body, or the head is the main place to protect. So yes, you could connect it to some extent. He went for the hip, that was the least protected, whatever the reason, because as I said, extremities, it's not the ikr, it's not the moyach, it's more of an outside element. But bottom line is, as long as the gula is not here, we're not fully 100%, obviously completely surrounded by the stones. And we have to build that protection. Okay, moving on. What is the significance of the angel changing his name to Yisroel, and why does he retain his name Yaakov then? If Hashem confirmed to Yaakov, you will no longer be called Yaakov, but you will now be called Yisroel, why does the Torah continue to call him Yaakov in many different places after he was supposed to be called Yisroel from that point forward? So, if you learn, Chassidus talks about this at length. So Yisroel, let's start with that. It was a power of Hisapche here. It's coming dafka from the angel of Esau. It gives him this powerful name, Sarisi Imalikim Ba'anoshim Batuchal. Yisroel is the high name, the quality name that Eden would be called, Bnei Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, because it shows that we can be in this material world, fight the battles, even with the angels, and prevail. What better blessing? He gave Yaakov that strength. But that doesn't mean Yaakov doesn't have the meaning, the name Yaakov doesn't have a role. In many places in Chassidus, I just mentioned one big place is in Samach Vav. He says 2 levels of neshama. Yisrael represents Li Reish, the higher level of the neshama, that has the power to prevail and transform. Yaakov is Yud Ekev, the Ekev of the neshama, as the neshama comes down below to transform even the Ekev. Remember, the name Yaakov came from Yitzchak and Rivka. It's also a holy name. That's why it doesn't go away. It's just there's 2 dimensions where Yaakov is involved more in the Ekev of things. That's when he's called Yaakov. Yisrael is the more loftier dimension. And you need both. Yaakov and Yisrael, they come together. The neshama l'mayla has to come down to the neshama l'mata. Like it says, Shchira ani v'nova. The neshama below says, I am dark in the world of Ekev, but it's a Yud Ekev, the Yud in Ekev. But I am beautiful, because down below, even the Gaba B'nai Yerushalayim, the way neshamas are above, there's something that's achieved after when you transform the darkness into light. But this you could look up the Maamorim that talk about Yaakov and Yisroel. Okay. Next question. There's a lot of questions. I'm just looking at the time, what kind of time we have here. Why is Yitzchak the only one of the patriarchs that did not have his name changed? Someone put it this way. Hi, Rabbi Jacobson. I have 2 questions for your Sunday night program. 1, how come Avram, Sarai, and Yaakov all had their names changed later in life to a new name that better expressed their personality and mission, but Yitzchak never had his name changed? Was there something perfect about Yitzchak and his name that it didn't need to be altered or changed, since Yitzchak represents Gvura? We do know that Gvura on its own is not perfect. It's only perfect when it's balanced with Chesed, which becomes tiferes. So why no name change for Yitzchak? Well, first of all, it's not better express their personality. Everything is stages. There was a time when Avram that was his role. Seichel Hanela Mikol Rayon, as the Alter Rebbe explains. Avram. Then it's Avraham, Av HaMoin Goyim. He becomes Avram of all the nations. Same thing with Sarai and Sarah. And same thing with Yaakov and Yisroel, as we just explained. Yitzchak Take is called Eila Tmima, a pure offering, who never left Eretz Yisrael. His Aveda is a different Aveda. Halah, instead of Hamshachet. Many ways to explain it. Since his name did not need to be changed, because it's exactly what it is, and Yitzchak also Lashon Asid, that will call Yitzchak Avinu, because it represents the smile, it represents the laugh, the simcha that comes from Avedas HaBerurim. So Yitzchak, the way he was, that's how he remained. And maybe the Akedah had to do with it. The Akedah purified him in that sense. The first one that was Nimel L'Shmeina Yomim, 8 days. He had a shleimus to him, a tmimus to him. I've not seen this explanation given, but it's when you think about it, where the others went through shifts in their Aveda, and so their names reflected those different eras or stages. Second question he asks, are these names connected to tiferes? We are told that Yaakov represented the sphere of tiferes, which is the perfect balance of chesed and gvura. Are there some ways the sphere of tiferes can be expressed better and more fluently through the name Yisroel instead of the name Yaakov? Thank you and have a great week filled with revealed blessings. Well, the fact of the matter is, I have not seen this explicitly, but frankly, based on the discussion of Jacob and Esau, Yaakov and Yisroel, I should say, the confluence of the two is Taka Tiferes. Because we know Esau is Gvura. Yitzchak is Gvura de Gedusha. Esau is Gvura de Klipa. Yaakov is Tiferes, the combination of Chesed and Gvura in a bittul dik way. Yaakov is Shapodas Avram, so it combines Avram and Yitzchak. Avram Halid is Yitzchak. Comes together in Yaakov. And that you can explain, because Yaakov has both elements. How down below he transforms the Ekev into godliness, and Yisrael, the power of Mamayla of the Neshama of Yisrael, the power of Yisrael, Sarisim Elikim Vanoshim Vatucha. So maybe that's what captures Tiferes. Again, I need to research it more, but that's what comes to mind as you ask the question. Okay. The final question on the parsha, and some I'm going to have to leave for another time, is what lesson do we learn from the detailed descriptions and names of Esau's progeny? As I mentioned before, the end of the parsha. Talks about Dishan, Chemdan, Eshbon, and of course Magdiel, Remi, where it says Rabbi Akiva would learn many halachas from just one mark in the Torah. Here's a full pasuk that seems completely irrelevant to us today. Can you explain what we learn from these types of psukim? Torah's Heirah. So the answer is, if you look in the beginning of Vayeshev, he says that to appreciate the progeny of Yaakov, we start with the progeny of Esau. But that's not just a contrast, because it's the birur of Esau. Remember, the end of Parsha Vayishlach, like I mentioned, is the Malachim of Tehu. The whole birur of this world is represented by Esau's children, including Magdiel Remi, Rome, Edom, Malchus Edom. That's why the Torah describes it, because it's relevant to our Aveda. Then comes Vayeshiv Yaakov, Teldis Yaakov, that talks about the Shvatim that are the birur that refine Esau. That's the short answer in the context, again, of the central theme of the Parsha. So what do we take away from the Parsha? That we have the story of our lives, both personal, both collective, the battles that have been fought throughout history, the battles being fought today. When you have the battles between the Bnei Yishmael and the Bnei Esau, Bnei Edom, and within the middle of there, that's the story of Esau, Yaakov, and Yishmael, all playing itself out in our time. And as we've discussed a number of times, it's from the Zohar, the end of Va'era, and the Bolok, other places, including the Yalkut Shmeni, that at the end of days there'll be these confrontations. But then, as the Rebbe makes it clear from the Yalkut Shmeni, the Giyaz Man Golaschem, then the day it's all going to be a victory for the Yid, and the Mashiach will come, and the Gula will come. There'll be the birur of Esau, the birur of Yishmael, V'hoisel Hashem Amlucha, as we read, as Rashi says in this week's Parsha. Okay, let's do a few final questions regarding some follow-up. Do two questions. Do people with mental health issues or addictions have free will? This is a follow-up from last week's program where we spoke about the obligations of someone that has these challenges. So the answer is very straightforward. You could say the same thing with anyone that is incapacitated, God forbid, handicapped. Something that's not in our control, you can't be asked to have free will. You can only have free will of something that's in your control. Now, we expect a person not to be addicted, not to get themselves into trouble. But there comes a point where, let's say a person, God forbid, has become addicted. And they may not be able to help themselves at this point because they're already physically addicted or psychologically and emotionally. But they can help themselves to get help. You could say, I can't free myself. I'm now too bound to it. But what stops you? Get someone to help you then. And if not that, tell someone, I can't control myself. I need you to get me some help. Or the family has to get the person help. So even if he may not have free will to right now heal because he's, let's say, addicted to alcohol, but that doesn't mean he can't go get help to be freed from it. And that we do have free will over. Now what happens? You're talking about a person who's so far gone, his family cannot help, he's in denial, or so weak. So that already it's up to Hashem. I can't answer in each case what's really going on in a person's heart. Does he have the ability? Does he not? Very often that's the biggest question when dealing with people and counseling and so on. You want to know, can you do it and you don't want to? Or it's uncomfortable? Or you're really not capable? There's some people come to a point you don't know if they're capable. And that's not an easy question to answer. So then some Hashem Yireh Lelevov, Hashem sees what's going on in people's hearts. I rely Hashem will determine. It's not our job anyway to judge. Now, people who are incapacitated, whether it's mental illness or physical handicaps, obviously, something that's completely not in our control, you can't have free will, but there's always going to be free will somewhere. Now, what about a person who's completely, God forbid, like a vegetable? Okay, again, Hashem understands that. That's the ultimate of ha'inus. So I think it's the sensitive matters, very painful ones, but since I wanted to finish the topic, so someone wrote, in this context, I'm very confused about the idea of b'chira chavshis, that's free will. Does a person always have the ability to make the right decision? I mean, Hashem doesn't challenge more than the person can handle, absolutely. So obviously, you can always do the right thing. So why do we comfort ourselves by saying we did the best with what we had then? Clearly, we didn't do our best if we weren't perfect all the time in behavior. So if someone is terribly addicted, they actually have b'chira to do the right thing or not. Question. But they're not even controlling it anymore. And a person who commits suicide was really able to choose differently, but how can you say that? So again, we don't know the mysteries, what goes on in people's hearts. This is God's domain. Today, very often, when a person unfortunately does things that are self-destructive, very often, the Rebbe says in a number of places, we melamed schus, we look for merit, that the person came to a point where their free will was not there. Whatever reason, something happened. We don't blame them for it. On the contrary, we're compassion. So that's the general attitude. But in every particular case, it's case by case. Now, regarding being perfect, none of us are perfect. That's not what's asked of us. What the Medrash says, and the Rebbe quotes very often, is you're not given a challenge that you don't have the strength to deal with. So you'll say, what about people who have challenges and they didn't have the strength? They became self-destructive. They took their lives. So again, that's not up to us. That's up to God. Because there are extenuating circumstances. There are situations we may not fully understand. And definitely we don't judge anyone when you're not in their shoes. And all the humility that comes with that. So we have to be very careful when we tread in these areas. And above all, sensitivity and the dignity of every person. So I just want to make sure we're not talking about something we have the right to determine and decide. And it is possible. There are situations where a person, as much as they try, Hashem did not allow them that free will. So of course, l'chatchila, we always expect someone to do the best you can, work at it, you have the strength, but after the fact, again, it's not our job to say, oh no, they failed, they had the free will, it's their fault, etc. Not necessarily, as we discussed. Finally, hostages freed. I'm a person that complained to God many times since October 7th about the hostages and how it's unfair and unjust that they were kidnapped and held in deplorable conditions. However, now that they are safely returned, I want to apologize to Hashem for my angry tone, and I want to say thank you for helping get the last 20 people safely home. Although it wasn't my intention to be disrespectful to Hashem, I did and said the things I did because I cared about my fellow Jews, but I do acknowledge that sometimes I crossed the line and was disrespectful, and for that I apologize. I thank you for saying that. I actually met some of these Hashtads just last Motzei Shabbos at the Oil. They came, they were here, they were in Washington, New York. I spoke for them at the Oil last Motzei Shabbos. Such gentle souls, beautiful Kadeshim, Mamish, living Kadeshim, who went through what they went through. But I appreciate what you said. It's good to apologize to Hashem and to all of us that we have to sometimes acknowledge, yes, we do get upset, but this is a good sign, a good exercise of your free will, where we're accountable. We show accountability. Remember, trust is not built on perfection. It's built on accountability. And with that, we'll conclude this program, MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 570. We're here every Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. Everyone have a good Tavoch, a good Yontif, you could call it Yud Kislev. From this, we should go to Yud Kislev to Yud Tes Kislev. It should be a Geula, the ultimate Geula, Amitis Vashlema, long before Chanukah. And again, Yefutza Meinesecha Chutza, Osimar Do Malka Mashiach.
This program is brought to you by MyLife Chassidus Applied. Please help us continue our programs. Make even a small contribution at chassidusapply.com/donate.